Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets. I am your host Hassan Javraj. Join us for insightful conversations with leaders in Islamic and global markets. As usual, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can also reach us at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Majlis and Markets. Today, we're looking at Saudi Arabia's economy. Since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman launched Vision 2030 in 2016, Saudi Arabia has undergone major changes. The kingdom is opening up its society and reshaping its economy by investing in industries like mining and tourism. A key part of this transformation is the financial sector, which is driving much of this progress and attracting global attention. To help us understand these developments, we're joined by Abdulaziz Naim, founder and managing director of Mayar Capital. With over 20 years of investment experience, Abdulaziz brings a unique perspective, both on global and Saudi markets. In this episode, we'll also discuss the rise of responsible investing, its merits, criticisms, and whether it can lead to better returns and a better society. Abdulaziz Naim, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Abdulaziz, I think this is the first time, I was just talking to you offline, and I think this is the first time we're actually talking, albeit over Zoom. But I followed your work and I followed your career on LinkedIn, and you're very active, mashallah, on the social media and on Arabic media as well, and in addition to English media. And you've done like a lot with your fund and your career. But before we get into all of that, could you give our listeners like your early life and your background story?
Sure. So I was born in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. That's in the eastern coast of Saudi. I grew up there and lived there for up until university, and then I went to MIT for my undergrad. So I lived in Boston for about 3 years and moved back to Saudi and effectively launched what became the Mayar Fund when I was in college. The current fund is essentially a successor to that. And moved to London at the beginning of 2015. And Mayar continued to grow from there on. And this is where I live now, 10 years later. Kind of the short version of it, I guess. We manage about $500 million of assets, mostly in our global responsible strategy, which is also a Sharia compliant strategy. And essentially, it's the same thing that I've been doing for the past 20 something years.
Fantastic. And you grew up in Saudi in the 90s?
I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, yeah.
Wow. So like, what was it like growing up in the 1980s and 1990s Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's very different than it is today. I think if you kind of had someone from the 80s and 90s put them in a time machine, brought them to Saudi today, they would not be recognized as the same country. It's changed in a very profound way. I think to start with, it's in the 80s and 90s, it genuinely, and this is potentially, you could say that about a lot of countries, the developing countries, but it really felt like a developing country in the 80s and 90s. And now in many ways, it's a developed country. I think the infrastructure, for example, that you have today is probably at par or better than many developed countries. But I think in many aspects of everyday life, it's changed, and a lot of it had to do with globalization. I think technology, digitization, it really is a very different place from that regard. And I think that started to really be different in the 2000s. And I think in the 2010s, especially after 2016, under King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, it's just the pace of change has accelerated. They announced the Vision 2030 back then, and it's changed in all kinds of aspects. So economically, it's changed. It's diversified away from oil. It's not mission accomplished yet, but a lot has been done. Certain aspects of the economy have really boomed in the non-oil sector. And then I think socially it's really transformed, and it's liberalized. It's become much more open to the world. I think probably the biggest change probably is the role of women in the economy and society. That's really profoundly changed. Uh, so a lot of things have changed, and I think the pace of change has been fast and continues to be fast, probably for the next decade. So I don't see the pace of change changing. That's a mouthful. Anytime soon. Whereas in the 80s and 90s, it really felt like nothing was happening.
Fantastic. And before we get into like the specifics of what's been happening since 2016 with Vision 2030, Abdulaziz, you mentioned like you went to the US. What was that like going from, say, 1980s, 1990s Saudi to like the US and studying over there?
Massive culture shock. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be from a family where we traveled every other year. So I'd been to the US once before I went to college. Sorry, it was twice before I went to college. Uh, we've traveled a little bit. Uh, so I've been outside Saudi, which is not what others can say who grew up in that era. Uh, and so I think, but it was still a cultural shock for me. And and I think it changes your view of the world. It's one reason why I believe when my wife and I had kids, we had a discussion, and I remember we said we have to make sure as much as we can that they go and visit different countries and different places in the world. We have a rule where we try to go to a city trip at least once a year. Even though some people think trips can be boring and rather go to the beach or whatever, but it's that exposure to different cultures that I think is extremely important and very profound. And actually, I think the roots of the change in Saudi that's happened since 2016 goes back to the scholarship program that Saudi launched in 2001, where tens of thousands, actually probably even hundreds of thousands of Saudis went to study in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in Asia. And I think they came back in the mid to late 2000s. And that I think completely changed their worldview. And I think it also changed the worldview of their families and friends because now they've been exposed to someone who's just seen other cultures and other ways of life. And I think that is probably one of the reasons that we see the changes that are happening today.
Amazing. Abdulaziz, we had Tim Callan on earlier this year. Tim Callan is obviously famous for being the former IMF chief economist to Saudi Arabia. And he was on a panel, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, with the IMF, the new IMF chief economist going to Saudi Arabia. And I had to read through the IMF paper, on the latest paper on Saudi Arabia. And Tim, at the time, he gave us like a nice breakdown of what Vision 2030 was and why it was important. But as someone being from Saudi Arabia and yourself being Saudi, I think you've alluded to this a little bit. How profound was this Vision 2030 in terms of transformation?
I think it's been extremely profound. I think it's really been transformative, culturally and economically. Uh, One of the things that Saudi had struggled with in the past is long-term thinking. And what the Vision 2030 did is it gave everyone a clear path to where things are going. It clarified government intentions on policy reform, infrastructure investment, everything that we've seen since and continue to see. And I think that galvanized private capital to go and also invest, and it just gave the private sector clarity on what's to come. Uh, but I think the other aspect to it, so that's kind of the planning and kind of signaling aspect of the vision. But then I think the other aspect is it actually changed the inputs that go into economic growth. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the role of women in the workforce, and female participation went from something like 12% when the vision was announced to I think 37% today. It's a massive shift there.
Hmm.
Uh, that's unleashed a lot of talent that has come into the private sector and the government sector and helped kind of move things forward. So that's tangible difference. Some of the reforms that happened to the judiciary, corporate law, investment law, all of these things also help clarify regulation, simplify regulation, make it easier to invest, start a business, and grow. All of these things came out of the vision, and I think we're at the early days. I would argue it's early days in seeing the true economic impact of these changes. I personally think they're the most important part of the vision. These reforms, and then obviously it also opened up a lot of new sectors that did not exist before. Everything from tourism to entertainment to just a vast services sector that did not exist before.
Yeah, it's been about what, 8 years since it was launched, so it's not like a significant long time period for sampling these changes. But Abdulaziz, when we look at some of the changes that have been made or some of the transformations that have been made, how would you characterize the diversification efforts? We can talk about things like tourism, so non-religious tourism, mining, other sectors. What are your thoughts on the diversification efforts?
So the diversification efforts have to be split into two, I think. One is a diversification of the government source of income, and the other is a diversification of GDP itself. I think diversification of the government source of income has been massive. I mean, the ratio of, I think, non-oil revenue for the government is approaching 50%. It used to be low single digits. So that's a massive, massive change. And that gives one of the most important outcomes of that diversification of government income. That it used to be that the government operated in a boom bust cycle. So when oil prices go up, the government starts spending, projects start to happen, salaries go up, they hire people, and then you have an oil cycle decline, and then they start cutting down because you've got this massive pro-cyclical spending. And it was extremely disruptive to the economy. So having a more stable revenue base as a government allows the government to plan ahead and spend more consistently and smooths out this boom bust cycle that's tied to oil prices. So I think that's been really good. The diversification as a percentage of GDP, however, is not there yet. So the government has been, I think, very open about where they are. I think there are many things where the vision is either on track or exceeded targets. I think as a percentage of GDP, it's too early to declare victory. But it's still 2024, so it's still 6 years to go, and the government has already started talking about Vision 2040. So it's not one and done. And I think a lot of progress has happened, and a lot of the fruit of the work that's been done is going to come in the years from now until then, because there's a lot of kind of work that has happened, but you haven't seen the results yet because it's more infrastructure and kind of type, whether it's physical infrastructure or legal infrastructure, or I think you can see the input, still don't see the output yet.
One area I think that's interesting from my perspective, having covered Saudi since 2030, is the financial sector. Back in the day, in like 2013, I used to write about these deals, like Saudi Electricity Company issuing a sukuk, and that was pretty much it. And that there was like very local transactions. But like, say, since 2017, there's been like this huge proliferation of like Saudi bond and sukuk issuances, in addition to other financings as well. How much of this transformation has been financed by external capital?
I think the external capital is still a minority percentage of the money raised. Some of it is, but Saudi is fortunate among developing countries, is that it happens. Yes, it's a developing country, but it's actually a wealthy developing country. And so one of the challenges that many developing countries or emerging markets face normally is, in order to invest, to grow and become a developed country, they need to rely on outside capital to finance that transformation and that growth. Saudi is fortunate by already being wealthy that it doesn't need that money. It's not that it doesn't want to, and that'll help accelerate things. But a lot of the work, the stuff that has happened, the stuff that will happen, can be financed internally because it's already a rich country, and that's a really fortunate place to be.
I mean, are you not worried about the level of debt that's increased, public debt that's increased in the last couple of years?
I mean, it's increased, but it's still very low by global standards. And then the other thing is you have to put that debt against the other side of the balance sheet, which so the balance sheet is still net cash or net investment. There is no net debt on the balance sheet if you look at it kind of from a macro government perspective. So I don't think there is a worry about it. And they've been very disciplined, and we've seen some of the outcomes of that discipline the past several months in terms of coming out and being very open about uh, where discipline needs to be, whether it's cutting some spending or pushing out some of the projects that have happened. I think the Minister of Finance was very open about that to make sure that the balance sheet remains healthy.
Yeah, the IMF report that I mentioned, like it made that the government is now a little bit more prudent in its spending compared to the last previous years. And obviously the finance minister, Mohammed Al-Jadhan, has also like come out and said like they're going to be more monitoring these things, and like if they have to cut spending or reduce spending in one area, that and then they'll see like how the results go. But Abdulaziz, in terms of the business environment, is it still quite a difficult place to do business for foreign companies?
I would say it's a lot easier than it used to be. And you can see that, for example, you mentioned the IMF numbers and the World Bank rankings, for example. Uh, in many aspects of the ease of doing business, Saudi has moved up the ranks, and I think it's heading in that direction. Is it? I don't think it's a mission accomplished yet, but it's definitely heading in the right direction. And then in many ways, I mean, we look at it, here we are sitting in the UK. Saudi and the UK have swapped places in the World Bank survey over the past 10 years. So Saudi took the UK's place and the UK took Saudi's place. So in terms of where things are heading, I think that's very positive.
Yeah, another thing that I thought was interesting that they updated the investment law, and I also think that the I think it was it to do with arbitration or to do with like legal disputes. They've also tried to enhance that legislation there as well.
I think the thing that people don't talk enough about is the reforms that are happening in the judiciary, whether it's inside the actual court system, whether it's, like you said, changes in allowing arbitration to the splitting off of business courts, but even inside the courts themselves, the retraining of judges, creating of institutes to train judges, new laws that standardize things, creating rules around precedent. A lot of these things are really, really important and were sources of pain for businesses in the past. Because the one thing about businesses is not the difficulty of something that bothers you the most. As a businessman, this is how I think about it. It's the uncertainty around it. So it's not how difficult it is, but it's the range of potential outcomes. It's okay if something is hard but clear. It's when it's not clear that you're worried. And so introducing clarity and reducing the arbitrary nature that used to exist in the legal system, I think that is huge. And I think the fruits of that will be extremely positive in the coming years.
One other thing that came to my mind is that the last time I went to the kingdom was in 2018, so it's been a while since a lot of the
You definitely have to go. It's changed a lot.
For sure, it's changed a lot. But one of the things I remembered when I went there is that when I went to a local shopping mall after a conference I was attending, I was in a shop, and usually in a lot of Gulf countries, you expect the person to be from another country. And I think up until like very recently, that would have been the case in Saudi.
Mm-hmm.
But what was interesting is that the shop person that was serving me, he was actually a Saudi person. And I just got chatting to him and saying to him, like, why did you take this job? And was it like did it bring shame to your family or something? And he said, no, the new generation, like, they're happy to work like all level jobs, skilled, high skilled, low skilled, even medium skilled. Would you say that's been like quite a big thing in Saudi in the last 8 years?
Oh, absolutely. And then also you talk about 2018, and now almost half or more of people in that position are probably going to be women. I mean, you land in the airport in Saudi, and half the people working behind the counter stamping passports are Saudi women now. So that's tremendously changed.
And Abdulaziz, one other area about Saudi, just sticking on Saudi for a second, is that the ECM market. We talked a lot about the debt capital markets, but the ECM, the equity capital markets
Mm-hmm.
within the kingdom itself, has been really active over the past couple of years. Why do you think there's been a lot of companies IPOing over these past couple of years?
Well, there's been a strong push from the regulators several years ago to make it easier to go public and really encourage companies to go public. And so that's one side of it. The second side, I think, is that you're seeing a lot of generational transitions in family businesses. So that is also another reason you have a new generation, second or third, depending on the business, where they see the advantage of being a public company, whereas older generations may have been kind of just obsessed with keeping their financials private. Uh, so I think that's the second part. But also, actually, the government has been pushing or incentivizing companies to go public. Some of the government programs that help grow the private sector, for example, are only open to publicly traded companies. And the reason the government did that is that they want to see, or essentially, they want to encourage the transparency that comes from being a public company. And so when the government is dealing with something and incentivizing something, they want the other side of the table to be a publicly traded company because that increases transparency. But also, it means that the benefit isn't going to one person or one family. The public shareholders are benefiting from these government programs.
How can Saudi Arabia improve its international image? I know they've been doing a lot over the past couple of years, but I think you've talked on other podcasts that the international image of Saudi Arabia is sometimes not always given in the best light. How can they improve that?
I don't think it'll change overnight. I think it's already starting to change. But you can see some of the things that are happening. I mean, I'll give an example. I was very skeptical about some of the money spent on getting people like Ronaldo to come to Saudi when it first happened. I've completely gone and changed my mind to the other. I think it's a brilliant investment now. I've been in random places in London and the United States and in Sweden and in Germany, different places, and I see these kids wearing a Nasser kits, jerseys that say Nasser on it and Ronaldo in the back, this idea. I was talking to several people. So my wife's previous someone she worked with, her son now, and Nasser is his favorite team because he likes Ronaldo, and so this is a kid who was born and grew up in London, and his favorite team is a Saudi team. That wouldn't have happened otherwise. The idea that you can see people. A friend of mine was at a hotel on a business trip recently in Europe, and they were playing a Nasser game on TV. Like it's just crazy. That wouldn't have happened before. And I think that takes time, but just awareness that, by the way, there are people there who are doing something who care about football just like you do. It makes it easier for people to identify with a culture that they don't understand. So I think that's part of it. I think tourism is probably going to have the biggest impact on that. There are people that I know personally who've known me for a very long time, but have never visited Saudi, and so they're not even completely biased against Saudi. They're already positively predisposed, and they go to Saudi and they come back and like, wow, we did not expect to see that. Completely blown away, change their mind. How can we get involved? How can we invest? So I think a combination of some of the stuff that's happening around uh, tourism, Expo, World Cup, uh, sports, all of these things are really changing public perception. I think it's not going to change overnight because, for one, I think there's a certain percentage of the population that are just too old to change their mind, to be completely frank. And so, but you talk to young people today, and they are not growing up with the bias, the negative bias, and the negative image in their heads that maybe the previous generations have. Quite the opposite. They're seeing Saudi now very positively. So it's just a passage of time, and more of what's happening, I think, will change the narrative in people's heads.
And just sticking on Saudi Arabia for the last point, Abdulaziz, the IMF and also the webinar that I attended with Tim, they mentioned about the Chinese and other external trade partners. Obviously, the US is the major trade partner, and China's become, I think, number one top trade partner with Saudi, and India is also in there as well. How much would the a slowdown in China or economic contraction in China or India impact Saudi's trade?
Well, I think the big thing, which you already see, is in the oil price, is that a slow-growing China is going to require less oil, and that's the big number there in terms of the trade between China and Saudi. It's exporting crude to China, and that's why oil prices have come off. I think that's the big delta there. I think outside oil, it's not as big as kind of other countries like United States and European Union.
Great. And Abdulaziz, as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was your fund, Mayar Capital. To begin with, could you tell us a little bit about the fund? And then I had a few other questions in my head, but yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about the fund and like what kind of asset classes are you investing in and what kind of investors are you serving?
So Mayar basically does one thing. The way we think about it is we look for to invest in publicly listed equities that satisfy three things. One, we only want to invest in great businesses, and we define great businesses as businesses where the economics are favorable, stable, and favorable means that they earn higher returns on capital. Stable means that they're generally predictable, and they have the opportunity to reinvest and grow. The second thing we look for is we call great companies, which means management teams that are working for the benefit of shareholders, have good capital allocation track records, and a strong balance sheet. And those two things basically then need to be acquired at great value. So we want to only buy these things when they're trading below what we think they're worth, giving us a margin of safety in our principal, because we also identify as value investors. So those are the three things that we look for: great business, great companies, and great value. And tied to all of that is two very important things for us. One is we call ourselves responsible investors. For us, responsibility means that we need to invest in a way that we think is basically in line with our ethical values. We think of ourselves as business owners, and so it comes naturally to us that we only want to invest in businesses that we can identify with ethically, because we do think that as shareholders, we are morally responsible for the actions of the companies that we own. And then all of that sits on a bed of a process that is designed to help us deal with our behavioral biases. And it's something that has been very important to me over the past 2 years. It's only become more and more important as the team grows, which is we as human beings are always subject to behavioral biases that make our decision making either flawed or inconsistent. And so in order to overcome these biases, it's not just enough to be knowledgeable about them or know that they exist, but we also have to use tools that help us control it. And the tool that we use is something that we call our multi-checklist scoring system. And so we basically use a checklist that covers each aspect of the business before we invest in. And we score companies on these aspects. And that allows us to compare companies across industries and the opportunities that we're looking at, but also allows us to compare things over time, giving us not only a more consistent decision-making process, but also a feedback mechanism so that we can learn from mistakes, because we will make mistakes from time to time. And so that's the framework of where we invest. We mostly invest in global markets. That's what we've done for the past 20 years. But a year ago, we launched our Saudi responsible strategy where we invest in Saudi equities. And that's also just over a year now. And it's been working out really well, and we're very excited about it.
And I think on your website, you say you're a signatory of the PRI, right?
That's correct.
So why did you decide to sign up to the PRI?
Well, when we signed up to the PRI, we didn't really change anything in the way we do. Uh, it's what been doing all along. So when we came across it, and I think when we signed, it used to be called the UNPRI. But the principles of responsible investing, essentially what I was saying earlier. So the framework that we use is something that we call the responsible business owner framework. And basically what it says is we believe as shareholders of companies, whether we own 0.1% or own 100% of a company, we are morally responsible for the actions of the companies that we own. And as a result, not only will we look at what a company is doing to make sure that it's consistent with our ethical value before we invest, but we will monitor things on an ongoing basis and try to intervene if something happens that we don't agree with and try to change it. And that's basically what the PRI wants you to do. And so when we came across the PRI rules, we looked at it and said, oh, wow, this is exactly what we've been doing all along. So it was a no-brainer to sign up for it.
And do you think a lot of fund managers, they understand the PRI? Because whenever I read research, like from HSBC, asset management, or others, a lot of them say that asset managers don't really understand the PRI or find it hard to integrate the PRI into their investment thesis. Do you think it's difficult to do that for some fund managers?
I think to be completely honest, for us, it was extremely organic. It's what we've been doing. I'm very skeptical about someone who does it inorganically. So I'm very skeptical when someone says, "Oh, this is the ESG person on the team," and I'm like, "What about everyone else? They're not like they don't care about ESG. Like you're an ESG fund, but you have someone who's checking after you because they don't. Either like you said, don't understand, or they don't trust you that you're going to be doing it." And so I'm very skeptical when someone says, "Oh, we have an ESG fund and a non-ESG fund," and I'm like, yeah, that doesn't resonate for me. To me, you're either doing it because you think it's the right thing to do, in which case that's the only thing you will do, or you're just doing it because you want to sell more and it's just a marketing gimmick. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these things. And we've seen this with kind of this whole ESG movement. I hate the term, by the way, ESG, because when it came out, I was telling people, it was like, Wall Street is going to find a way to destroy this and create a scandal out of it. And sure enough, they have, with the whole greenwashing scandals that we saw. So I think the second you make something kind of a marketing gimmick, that just brings in the wrong people who are doing it for the wrong reasons.
And Abdulaziz, I think you also mentioned, as we were speaking offline, that your fund is also halal. So you invest in Sharia compliant asset classes as well, right? Or Sharia compliant.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
So would you say like your screening, or like if we say like, would you say ESG or ethical finance are the same as SRI and Islamic finance? Do you think?
I think there's like a 90-something% overlap between the two.
You think that they're very close to each other?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because like a lot of people I've spoken to say like there are similarities, but there are like some differences, right, between like say ethical and ESG, SRI and Islamic.
I mean, I've been investing this way for September 24 years now. It started in 2000. I mean, there are very, very few areas that don't overlap, practically speaking.
And Abdulaziz, when you see like a lot in the US, there seems to be this backlash, I think, as you mentioned, with greenwashing, and even in like there are some people in the community which say faith washing with Islamic funds. How do you mitigate against these kind of risks of greenwashing or faith washing?
I think the problem with the way people approach this is they want to view it, they want to have their cake and eat it too, I think. So we had an argument. We were at a sales pitch with this U.S. allocator, and it was very clear kind of halfway through that he was anti ESG and anti any of these things. And I remember he said, "Well, who gave you the authority to decide what is moral for me?" And I said, "No, I'm not making a decision about what's moral for you. What I'm telling you is that I'm trying to explain to you how we will invest.
Hmm.
And just in the same way we explain to you how we judge management teams and how we judge businesses, I'm also going to explain to you how we invest ethically. And it's for you to decide whether that aligns with your ethical values or not. And if it doesn't align with your ethical value, then you shouldn't invest with us. And if you does align with your ethical value, then you should. To me, the idea that we should come and either regulate how each person does it is nuts. Because we don't come and say, oh, we are going to regulate how you judge a management team to be a good management team or a bad management team, or how are you going to judge the growth opportunity of one company or another? You don't. You trust that the management of the fund manager and their team are going to make a best effort judgment on that aspect. And I think it's the same thing with other things. And if you agree with them, you invest. And if you don't agree, you don't invest. And if you invest and you change your mind, you sell the fund. So to me, I find it bizarre that people get really upset about it and say, well, why are you doing this? And who gave you the authority? Which is kind of the US, the thing you hear in the US often in terms of backlash. And all I'm saying, listen, I'm going to offer you something the same way a restaurant offers you a particular way of cooking, I don't know, a sea bass. And if you like it, you can come here, order the sea bass. And if you don't like sea bass, then you don't come here. It's just, to me, it's the same thing. As the only thing that I think is important is transparency. You have to make sure these things are transparent. People know, are open about it, and then let the investor decide how they want their money to be invested.
And do you think that ES or like ethical or SRI or Islamic stocks generally over time perform better than like ethical stocks or companies?
In all honesty, I'm skeptical about that argument. That whether it's SRI or SG does better over time. Uh, to me, I can see why they are lower risk than otherwise. For example, if you have two chemical companies and one is dumping chemicals into the river and the one next to it is not dumping chemicals into the river, there's a risk that the one that is dumping chemicals into the river is going to get caught at some point and get fined. And so to me, the one that is not dumping chemicals is going to be a lower risk investment than the one dumping chemicals. I think you could make the same argument with governance, for example, where if you have a management team that is kind of getting into gray areas and really pushing the envelope, at some point they may cross a line and then they either screw you as the shareholder or get into trouble and get punished by the regulators. So that's another one where there may not be upside to good behavior, but there is clear downside to bad behavior. So the G and the E to me, I see the big benefit is lower downside risk from a business perspective. I think the social one can manifest in many ways, but I think a company that is a good citizen, I suspect that over time does avoid scandals and problems. So there is some downside protection, but there is probably also some upside benefit to being a good citizen as a company, in terms of, especially you see that with a younger generation consumers wanting to spend their money with businesses where they align with their ethical values. To some degree, you can argue that that would easily be priced into the stock, and so there shouldn't be a long-term impact positively on the performance. But I think on an aggregate basis, I can see how investing ethically at the very least reduces downside risk. To me, to be completely honest, I think whether it does better is an irrelevant question. I think in the end, you want to invest in a way where you sleep better at night, you feel good about what you do. Uh, when you're 60, 70 years old and you look back at your life, uh, are you going to say, well, I destroyed the planet and I did a lot of things with my money that I don't agree with, but hey, I did 1% more, right? I think when you look back at your life in the end, you want to feel good about what you did. And to me, that's the biggest driver to invest in the way that we do. You don't want to have regrets later on about the way you've invested your money.
Very true. Abdulaziz, tell us more about any current or upcoming projects you may be working on.
So our hands are full now. We're managing two strategies and multiple funds, and some people invest through separately managed accounts. So we've been very busy with that. Our Saudi strategy is going to launch as a usage fund in the next few months. That's going to open up the opportunity for people to invest in it. So we're very excited about that. We're getting a lot of interest from UK and investors who we talked about earlier about kind of the changing perception of Saudi, who really see the opportunity on invest in there. So we're very excited about that. I think on the global strategy, for example, the past couple of years have been dominated by the Magnificent Seven, really driving up kind of performance of indices. I think that's going to reverse. I think we're going to start to see better performance from the non-tech sector over the next 3 years. So that's something that we're really excited about. Looking at our portfolio right now, we're seeing some of the best opportunities we've seen in a very long time. So it's keeping us busy, putting money to work, and we're very excited about seeing those results over the next 3 years.
Amazing. And Abdulaziz, how can people find out about Mayar Capital?
Well, the best way is to go to our website. We are very transparent about information there. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. We post a lot of stuff on YouTube, or our quarterly investor Q&As or annual meeting and the events that we have from time to time. So there's a lot of information there to find out more about Mayar, and you can always reach out to us or our team at ir@mayarcapital.com, investor relations, ir@mayarcapital.com.
Great. I'll link it in the show notes after we've had this chat. But Abdulaziz and I, this has been a fantastic conversation. I wish you all the best on the launch of the fund and for the rest of 24 and going into 25.
Thank you so much. It's been fun having this conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time and giving me the opportunity to be here today.